on C-SPAN's original series, First Ladies, Influence and Image, examining the public and private lives of the women who filled the position of First Lady and their influence on the presidency, from Martha Washington to Michelle Obama, tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, on American History TV on C-SPAN 3.
Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome Dawud Walid, who is the Executive Director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. He's joining us from Detroit. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Let me begin with some news on this Sunday morning, and it's front page of the Washington Post on an area that you're quite familiar with. In the first majority Muslim U.S. city, culture shock and fears of loss is the piece. A community that was predominantly Polish-American and now predominantly Muslim-American, including a majority city council in Hamtramck, Michigan, which is not too far from you. When you see this story and reaction, your thoughts?
Well, really here in our locality, it's really no big deal. The story of Hamtramck, Michigan is actually a very American story. This hamlet, as you stated, was a majority Polish-American at one time, and that's because Polish-Americans were not really welcome into the political process in the city of Detroit decades ago. They're Catholics, and due to anti-Catholic sentiment, anti-Polish sentiment, they settled into the area of Hamtramck and became basically politically dominant because they were the majority. Likewise, in metropolitan Detroit, Hamtramck has become a hamlet of Muslims, predominantly of Yemeni background, but also Bangladeshi, Bosnian, African-American descent, and they've made this into a neighborhood. And when people move into a neighborhood, they seek to shape the local politics. So it's really not very surprising that Hamtramck has a majority Muslim city council coming January 2016, and probably in the, if not near future, the near distant future, will eventually have a Muslim mayor.
And Dearborn, Michigan, which is also just outside of Detroit, grew significantly in part because of the Ford Motor Company now being viewed as the Arab capital of North America. Explain the evolution of Dearborn.
Well, Dearborn, Michigan is the mostly concentrated area of Arabs in these United States of America. All of those Arab Americans are not Muslim. There are some that are Christian. But when we look back about a century ago, the reason why there are so many Arab Americans in metropolitan Detroit is really Henry Ford and the automobile industry. Just like how African Americans migrated to Michigan from the Jim Crow South looking for job opportunities, Arab Americans came to this area for the same reason, and that's in part because Henry Ford was the first industrialist to offer a non-white man the same hourly wage on the assembly line as a white man. And we do know that Henry Ford had some issues regarding race. It wasn't like he was a Martin Luther King Jr. by any stretch of the imagination, but it was this policy that helped attract Arabs to the state of Michigan working in the automobile industry. And the Rouge plant, which is in South Dearborn, it borders a majority Yemeni American community to this day. And this goes back, though, to decades and decades ago with Henry Ford.
And let's look at some demographic information with regard to Michigan, courtesy of the American Immigration Council, which includes the overall population of Michigan is just under 2% are Arab Americans. But as you said, in Dearborn, it has the nation's largest proportion of Arab Americans, accounting for about half of the population, just over 44,000 residents, and that's according to the 2013 census. But I also want to ask you about the political rhetoric with regard to Muslims in this country. And I want to share with you this story this morning from the New York Times. The headline focusing on Donald Trump saying he heard cheers on 9/11 and is urging the surveillance of some mosques. I want to share with you what he told supporters over the weekend. Hey, I watched when the World Trade Center came tumbling down, and I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that was coming down. Thousands of people were cheering. Something's going on. We've got to find out what it is. Now, the New York Times points out it's not clear what Mr. Trump was referring to. There were cheers of support in some Middle Eastern countries that day, which were broadcast on television. But a persistent internet rumor of Muslims celebrating in Paterson, New Jersey was discounted by police officials at the time. A search of news accounts from that period show no reports of mass cheering in Jersey City. Your reaction?
Well, Donald Trump seems to be the political leader of false information and lies these days. I mean, keep in mind that he still is a person who champions, or at least he was very vocal in terms of the birther movement and questioning President Barack Obama's citizenship. So that he invokes false narratives to gain cheap political points is really nothing new for Donald Trump.
When he says that you're going to have watches over mosques in this country as a way to keep America safe, what do you think?
Well, I say that what he is putting forward is not only unconstitutional, but runs counter to the American values that we as a nation not only uphold for ourselves, but the values that we project to the rest of the world. That our country has a First Amendment. We believe in freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, but also freedom of religion. And there is no religious test for any group of people in these United States of America running for a political office, but also likewise, there is no legal justification for any house of worship to be monitored simply because of their faith affiliation or denomination.
We're talking about Muslim Americans and Islamophobia. Our phone lines are open for Democrats 202-748-8000. For Republicans 202-748-8001. We have a line for independents. You can also send us a tweet at C-SPAN WJ. This is the headline from Friday's Washington Post. Harsh rhetoric towards Muslims. What is it like to be Arab American, to be a Muslim in America today, following the events in Paris a week and a half ago?
Well, just for clarification purposes, I'm an African American, but in terms of the Arab American community, and particularly Syrian Americans, and also being American Muslim, this time is an extremely difficult time. It seems that American Muslims are being used as a political football right now, and that in our political discourse, perhaps the most accepted form of bigotry can be labeled or can be pushed upon Muslims with very little political pushback. I mean, we have in our political discourse, unfortunately, a native Detroiter like myself, Dr. Ben Carson, has made completely outrageous comments that he doesn't believe that an American citizen, just because of their faith being Islam, is suitable to be president of these United States of America or to sit on the Supreme Court. We have these nonsensical comments from Donald Trump about not only monitoring mosques, but putting forth a Hitler-esque type of framework that maybe American Muslims should walk around with ID cards. If this was any other religious group, if this was for Jewish Americans, Mormon Americans, Seventh-day Adventists, it would be absolutely unacceptable in our political discourse. But when it comes to Muslims, it's actually used as a fundraising strategy where they go out and make anti-Muslim comments. And in the case of Ben Carson, they do record fundraising in the process.
Is there any parallel, though, to what happened during World War II, certainly after the events of December 7th, 1941, as Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and that resulted in the internment camps of those Japanese Americans here in the U.S.? Not that we're getting to that point, but just the attitude that Americans had back in 1941-42 and where we are today in 2015.
I don't believe we're at that point yet, but God forbid if there's another major attack on our soil. But you know what you're saying is not completely out of the realm. There are people who have said these things out loud. Roanoke, Virginia's mayor just recently backtracked a couple of days ago, but he said within the past week, he put forth the notion that that American Muslims could be placed into internment camps. So there are actually people in the political establishment in city-states, as well as in the broader society, who actually believe and actually think that American Muslims could be dealt with the same way that Japanese Americans were unjustly dealt with after the attack of Pearl Harbor, in which Japanese Americans had nothing to do with the attack of Pearl Harbor, just like American Muslims have absolutely zero to do with Daesh or what just took place recently in Paris.
Our guest is Dawud Walid. He is the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, joining us live from Detroit. EJ is on the phone, Hot Springs, Arkansas, Independent Line. Good morning.
Yes, you do not assimilate, just kind of, you speak your own language when you're in your own group. You come over and you dress in your own customs. You just, when I see an Irishman or many others, I know they can't come over with good intentions because they've never yelled, "We want to kill you." You're the only religious people that say they want to kill people, and your belief is that you can get in heaven through those atrocities, where every other religion says you will go to hell if you kill, steal, lie, cheat. The other religions are all peaceful. They go, you must either be saved and adhere to some sort of good work.
Okay, EJ, I just want to jump in because you made some strong accusations. I want to make sure that our audience knows that that is not the belief of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, but we'll give our guest a chance to respond to your sentiment.
A lot was said right there in that statement. My family has been here in these United States of America for about 400 years. I'm speaking pretty good English, I think, and wearing a suit and tie. I have absolutely no idea what she's talking about in terms of this otherization of Muslims. But even in the mentioning of the Irish that she talked about, this plays into a long narrative of the racialization of religion in America and how different groups of people are made to be seen as the other. There's a very interesting book called How the Irish Became White. And a little over a century ago, Irish Americans were not classified as being white. Catholicism was seen as a non-white religion, and there were the same type of sentiments that were put forth that somehow Catholics weren't assimilating and Catholics had a secret plan to take over the United States of America. And John F. Kennedy, actually, who was assassinated this day, November 22nd, even when he was running for president of these United States of America, there was movements and a framework to try to otherize him outside of the American experience. The majority of victims of international terrorism, according to recent studies done by the University of Maryland, in which our State Department commissioned the study, up to 97% of victims of global terrorism are actually Muslims who are the ones who are victims of terrorism. So we have the greatest stake of speaking out against extremism and being against extremism because we are the #1 victims of extremism, be it from Al-Qaeda, Daesh, or Taliban, or be it from Christian militias in Central African Republic who are killing Muslims, or in Burma where Buddhist terrorists are killing Muslims. But this whole thing about the rest of the world religions preach peace, but Islam doesn't. Well, Islam actually is derived from the word salam, which means peace. Peace is the rule to Muslims, not the exception. And the only time we are allowed to even fight is in self-defense or as a means of trying to end oppression or bring about peace. But definitely what the caller said is very inaccurate and actually very extreme.
In fact, Jan Ness calling the caller bigoted and saying that Muslims are born in the U.S. as well. Before we continue, some quick background on you, Mr. Walid. You are a veteran of the U.S. Navy and also a former imam at in Detroit following the events of September 11th, if you could explain.
Yes, I served in the United States Navy, earning 2 Navy and Marine Corps achievement medals, and upon leaving the United States Navy and studying, I was assistant imam at a mosque called Masjid Wali Muhammad for quite a bit of time. It's actually the first mosque established in America for African Americans. And then I was also temporarily an imam at the Bosnian American-Islamic Center, which is actually located in Hamtramck, Michigan. So I have a very close connection to the Muslim community in Hamtramck, and in particularly to my Bosnian American brothers and sisters.
And from thinkprogress.com, this is the headline, Young and Muslim in America After Paris. Quoting one individual, we have to constantly prove that we are not terrorists. Let's go to Helen, joining us from Suffern, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to make a simple comment, and that's it's not all or nothing. I feel that the speaker is disregarding some of the core elements of the previous speakers. It is true that we can't lump everyone into one category. As a teacher in New York City, I have worked with wonderful Muslim families, and prior to 9/11 and post 9/11. But I have to say to you that when I went back with the teachers the third day after the towers fell, that I had students running into my classroom crying, saying that there were parties being held in their apartment building.
We'll get a response. Thank you, Helen.
I've never heard of such of any parties being thrown after 9/11. I do know that there were Muslims who were killed at 9/11, including first responders. I do know in the city of Detroit that we were involved in actually peace vigils and prayer vigils here. And we were also, to be very frank, we were standing guard at our mosque because we were in fear of blowback. And our Islamic centers, and including myself, I received death threats after 9/11. So I don't know anything about any parties, but I can say that for the overwhelming majority of the American Muslim community, that we felt hurt and actually doubly victimized. One, because our country was attacked, but two, we could forecast and know that there would be a referendum on Islam in America and worldwide, and that our faith would be portrayed in a negative light unjustly.
Let me go back to the reporting of Maggie Haberman of the New York Times and the accusation made over the weekend of Donald Trump, and that there were cheers taking place in Jersey City, a story that has not been confirmed by any accounts. And Hope Hicks, who is the spokesperson for Donald Trump, was asked about this latest accusation put forth by Donald Trump, and she would not elaborate on the comments. His aides have repeatedly declined to make Mr. Trump available to address the controversies over some of his statements. Ms. Hicks said only that Mr. Trump had drawn an unprecedented crowd of 10,000 in Birmingham, Alabama, adding Mr. Trump's speech was great and unbelievably well received. Let's go to Bill, joining us in Erie, Pennsylvania, Democrats line. Good morning.
Morning. I wanted to thank this gentleman for his service, first of all, and I don't think it's so much fear as it's we don't trust this government to keep us safe. All you got to do is go back to the Boston bombings and look at that whole scenario up there. How this one Tsarnaev brother can go back and forth to Chechnya or Kazakhstan. And how they ever pulled that off up there. I remember the 9/11 Commission report said, that we have to knock down these walls between the FBI and the CIA, and it didn't happen again. And we see over and over again where the government is the problem, not the refugees. And by the way, the gentleman was speaking about the Pearl Harbor. There were 4 or 5 Japanese spies that were caught in Honolulu that spied on the Pearl Harbor and gave that information to the Japanese when they did their bombing. So, if we look back at history, especially the last 6 or 7 years, we just don't trust this government to do the vetting. That's the problem. And as far as the religion, what I can't understand about a religion is when Muhammad was able to have 14 wives, and most of them were teenagers, from what I understand, and one was even as at the age of 9 years old. Now, if that happened in America today, if you go out, there's a sect out there somewhere in the West, Jeffers is the guy's name. He's in jail for exactly the same thing that Muhammad did when he was here on Earth.
Bill, thanks for the call. We'll get a response.
Again, there were so many things that was said in that statement. I will deal with one thing he mentioned about resources and trust in the government. How I believe the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security deals with terrorism here on the whole land, I think it really needs serious overhaul. There are a lot of misplaced resources in terms of the use of confidential informants. Also with mass spying, mass surveillance, we know what the NSA has been done in recent years due to the Eric Snowden leaks. And because there is so much information that is being collected and that there's so much mass surveillance that the actual people, the actual threats that need to be watched more carefully are actually slipping through the cracks. But it also goes back to when we talk about countering violent extremism, let us really look at who is committing terrorism here on the homeland and how it's being discussed. If we go on the FBI's website and we look at about the last 20, 25 years of who is committing terrorism here in these United States of America, you'll see that about 94% of the terrorism attacks that have taken place here in America have been committed by people who are not of the Islamic faith. They're predominantly white males, and they predominantly claim the Christian faith. So when we look at, on one end, we talk about the Boston Marathon bombing, which was horrendous and what was reprehensible. There were 6 human souls that were taken that day. Juxtapose that and how we talk about terrorism with that event. When there were 3 more souls, there were 9 individuals killed early this year in South Carolina at a black church. And then the FBI director, Comey, can't even call that an act of terrorism when a white supremacist bigot goes into a black church and commits mass murder in a church, but that's not labeled terrorism. So, I mean, it also goes back to like how we label and look at who are terrorists and who are the actual threats to our domestic tranquility here in these United States of America.
We are talking with Dawud Walid. He is the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Our next caller from London, England, Paul. Good afternoon to you.
Good morning to yourselves. How are you going?
We're fine, thank you. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, no worries. Mr. Walid, I just thought I'd ask this question here, which is how can any American be happy having very cheap gas, very cheap food in their homes, around their places of work, because of a mechanism called the petrodollar, and yet be anti-Islamic? You know, I'm a Christian. I got plenty of Muslim friends. I work with Muslims every day. They're great people. They don't drink alcohol, but they'll still come to the pub with me. They'll drink coffee. I'll drink a beer. I've got Jewish friends. They're similar sort of issue. And I just would like to know how can we move forward to actually get rid of the terrorist threat globally. I think actually the petrodollar is perhaps one of the major mechanisms that is causing a lot of this problem, because a lot of Europeans want to get rid of the Saudi Arabian regime, which is making money out of terrorism. But because you guys rely on that economically in the States so much, that mechanism, it basically means that you are shielding the Saudis from military or economic sanctions, which would actually get rid of the terrorism. It would put the fires out and would actually return us back to a time where we didn't need to be continuously building up militaries to deal with threats which could be dealt with by simply removing the economy, which is funding the very threat itself.
We'll get a response.
Thank you for that question. It's actually ironic because the caller's country Britain is actually one of the keys behind the establishment of the Royal Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There was no Saudi Arabia 100 years ago. There was a family, Ali Saud, who made a compact with the British to fight against the Ottoman Turks during World War I. And then when those Arabs, so that family was armed by the British, was sponsored by the British, they then brutally went and killed and put down the people within the Arabian Peninsula, and then later the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was established, and then oil was found there. And part of the justification that was used is that that family was fighting and killing other Muslims, and they did something what's called takfir, or pronounced them to be heretics and heathens. And this is actually the ideological roots or the basis for like these extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, like Daesh, in which their primary targets are Muslims. They pronounce these other Muslims as being deviants, innovators, and heretics, which then makes them, according to them, lawful to be killed. Now, in terms of the oil industry, the United Kingdom as well as the United States of America, we depend on our economy based upon oil, and particularly Saudi oil. And at the end of the day, a lot of maybe it's not our people, but the policymakers care more about capitalistic urges. Dollars make sense, and this is part of our national security interest. So good luck on the American government or the British government really holding the Saudi government accountable, as long as we are dependent on Saudi oil, and as long as we use them as a strategic partner in the so-called Middle East to push back the influence of Iran in the region.
This is a tweet from Stella, who says, "My issue is Muslims trying to change our way of life, our laws, our values and traditions to suit their beliefs." And that's the subject of today's front page story in the Washington Post. In a first majority Muslim U.S. city, culture shock and loss and fears of loss as Muslims' cultural and political growth puts some on edge. The story focusing on Hamtramck, Michigan, which is just outside of Detroit, where our guest is joining us on this Sunday morning. And Rafiq is our next caller from Fort Meade, Florida. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. How are you doing? And salam to the brother. I do have a pretty question to ask, and that is, why is it that when we have scholars or representative of the Muslim community, we are not preparing, because we understand what the public perception of Islam is when they have these derogative questions. I do a lot of work with non-Muslims. Let me just say this very clearly. And when we talk to them, when these same people would have these derogative statements, when we give them the facts of Islam and give them the way of our life, they will appreciate it and they are educated on it. Most of these people who call with these derogative statements are very ignorant of what Islam is, first of all. And secondly is, I challenge all my Christian brothers and sisters that let them find where it says in the Quran, it says kill Christians and Jews. And let them show us where in the statement it says that. Unless they can do that, please, we need to really caution our brothers and sisters, because all we're doing is spreading hate and spreading Islamophobia within the society. We see this continuously happen. It's the same exact method that was used in Europe against the Jewish people. And I'm surprised that more of the Jewish people does not come out against this fully.
Thank you. We'll get a response.
Thank you very much for that comment, Mr. Rafiq. I would like to, however, go back to the tweet that was said, and actually it's been mentioned twice, with the statement about Muslims not assimilating and us supposedly wanting to change the American way of life. Well, number one, there is no responsibility on any group of people who immigrate to the United States of America to assimilate into American whiteness, because really at the end of the day, when we talk about assimilating to America, that is pegged off of whiteness as being the standard of what it means to be American. Muslims or any other group of people have no responsibility to do that, and that does not mean that someone is not being a good law-abiding taxpayer citizen to not assimilate or use that as a standard of Americanness. That's number one. Number two is America is a work in progress and is evolving. And I, as an American Muslim, have the right to try to shape America more into the vision that I think America should be in order to make it a more perfect union. And that is really what the American project is about. And really, I think it speaks to a greater fear that a lot of Americans have, that there's changing demographics in America. Within the next few decades, America is going to be a majority minority country, meaning that there will be more people of color in America than white Americans. And I think that this really scares the mess out of people. So the same talking points that are used against Latinos and immigration, and let's build a wall on the southern border, and the same people who are against Syrian refugees coming here, even though there was not a single Syrian refugee that had anything to do with the Paris attack, are the same people who are condemning Muslims in America and saying that we don't have the right to speak Arabic, or we should alter our dress to look more Anglo-Saxon. And I think that this really comes from a Eurocentric white privilege mentality, and I don't accept that at all.
Mr. Walid, more than 30 governors, including Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, where you are, saying they do not want Syrian refugees in their respective state. Here's what Governor Snyder said, that the recent events of the past few weeks, including the violence in Paris and Beirut and over the skies of Egypt, remind us of the dangers our world faces from extremists who are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their methods to doing us harm. My primary responsibility is to keep the people of Michigan safe. That is why I've asked for a pause to the efforts to bring more refugees to Michigan, and requested that the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security to take full review of our security clearances and procedures for all refugees who have the potential to be placed in Michigan.
Well, in about the last 3 years, our office at CAIR Michigan, through the leadership of our senior staff attorney, Lena Mussery, has processed, I say, about 100 Syrians who have received either TPS, temporary protected status, or asylum. And these Syrians who fled from the violence that's taken place in Syria have been acclimating themselves to the American way of life. I'd say that Governor Snyder, look back in history and tell me one time of when any Muslim in the state of Michigan committed an act of terrorism within the past century. He won't find a single one. The Department of Homeland Security has very rigorous screening processes to let refugees in this country. It takes a couple of years for a refugee to get here in these United States of America. And our community, actually, we've been preparing to find suitable families, working in conjunction with Lutheran Family Services for 400 orphans. Like, what type of national security threat do 400 orphans pose to the state of Michigan, Governor Snyder? He doesn't have an answer for that. And I really think that it's a shameful period of history that we are living in right now. And I will also say that when we look at this issue, this has become a very partisan issue, because the overwhelming majority of these governors who are turning away Syrian refugees happen to come from the GOP. And that's just the reality.
A few more minutes with our guest, Dawud Walid, who is joining us from Detroit. Daryl from Defiance, Missouri. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to just agree with your guest 100%. The way I look at it is, we've been destabilized in the Middle East for over 40 years now. If you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, we have bombed more people than you can think of, and you wonder why we have refugees coming to America. They wouldn't have to come to America if we wasn't over there bombing their countries. We have a terrorist organization in America, and nobody ever speaks of it. That would be the CIA. Look what they do. They assassinate people. They overthrow governments. They destabilize governments. They do it all. They torture. They have black sites all over the world. I mean, what are we talking here? It's our insane foreign policy.
We'll get a response. Thank you. Mr. Walid.
Well, what is interesting about the caller's comment is that, we have a policy right now as being against the al-Assad regime. This administration, as well as the Bush administration, talked about the crimes of the Assad regime. Well, during the Bush administration, he was working along with the al-Assad regime, the Syrian regime, where there was black sites in which there was torture being done on behalf of our country in Syria, in which Bashar al-Assad was our so-called adversary, yet we were working with him and using him to torture people on our behalf. So let us not get into this American exceptionalist type of mentality to think that the rest of the world is involved in barbarism and savagery, and not look at the crimes that we have been committing as a nation, or our government, and the destabilization and killing that our country has been involved in, which has helped make the soil fertile for anti-Muslim, for anti-American sentiment, anti-Western sentiment, and has had the unfortunate effect of actually fueling terrorism in the so-called Middle East. Keep in mind that before we invaded Iraq off of false information, there was not a single suicide bombing. Suicide bombings were not taking place in Iraq. Now the number one casualties of terrorism in the world are in Iraq. So let us keep that in mind.
Our last call is Mohammed, who's joining us this morning from Flushing, New York. Good morning to you.
Hey, good morning. Well, the whole issue of terrorism, Muslim terrorism, is kind of ironic. Most of the terrorist attacks happen all over the world, from the European part of it, colonizing people, even the Syrian area, the country were divided by them, put people together, they are not supposed to be together. But right now, people against terrorism is a fear, and they are creating fear. You go arrest people, you put them in prison. If you go, you say Islamic terrorism. Islam is it's a contradiction. It's a peace. In the Quran, you don't kill any innocent person. Whoever kill one person, innocent, like you kill all the mankind.
We'll get a response. Thank you for your call.
Thank you, caller. And again, this goes back to the double standard that we have in labeling and who gets labeled a terrorist. If we look at the European Union statistics, we will see that the majority of people who have been committing terrorism within the past decade in Europe are actually white nationalists. And if we look back just a few years before Paris, so we had this tragic and horrible attack in Paris that took, I think, around 169 souls. If we go back a few years back, that the next worst terrorism attack in recent history that has taken place in Europe was in Norway, that was committed by Anders Breivik, who was a white nationalist, a Christian, and he had actually a plot or a plan of wanting to start a war, a race war, and a war against Muslims in regards to that attack, when over 100 people were killed in Norway. So again, I would say to the people who are listening or who are watching that yes, there is a problem of terrorism going on in the Muslim world. Muslims are, in fact, the number one beneficiaries of being killed by this terrorism, but terrorism is not only something that is anti-Islam, but it is something that is committed by people of different creeds and people of different ethnic backgrounds. It is not something that is Muslim specific. And
finally, with a half a minute left, certainly you don't condone some of the sharp rhetoric and harsh words that we've been hearing and seeing, but do you understand that sentiment?
I understand that people are enemies or scared of what they don't know. And I believe that as American Muslims have continuously condemned terrorism, and the Council on American-Islamic Relations have been on the front line of doing that, I think that we need more responsibility from our policymakers and from our elected officials to not speak about Islam and terrorism always in the same breath, and that if we are truly trying to make our country safer, these United States of America, that we need to deal with terrorism in a holistic sense to eradicate the roots of global terrorism, but also to deal with terrorism here at the homeland. And the number one perpetrators of terrorism here in the United States of America, in the homeland, are not Muslims, they're actually our white men.
We will leave it there. Dawud Walid, who is the Michigan Chapter Executive Director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And we will continue the conversation tomorrow morning, as we do every day on C-SPAN's Washington Journal. And among our guests will be Joseph Boardman to talk about Amtrak rail safety. He is the CEO and president of Amtrak. And we'll also check in with Patrick Tucker of Defense One on the ISIS use of encryption and the dark web to communicate. Just some of our guests and topics tomorrow morning on the Washington Journal. Be sure to tune in tonight at 9:35 Eastern Time, our conversation with Republican presidential candidate Ben Carson, part of our Road to the White House series. Thanks for being with us on this Sunday. Hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a great week ahead. Happy Thanksgiving.